1. Alexis Danielle Flanner. Alexis Danielle Flanner was in her early 20s when she entered the public eye for the worst possible reason, the killing of her sister-in-law, Estrella Mendoza, outside a Tulsa convenience store. A citizen of the Muskogee, also known as Creek Nation Flanner, did not have a widely documented professional profile or public persona. What is clear is the family link at the heart of this case, and the setting an ordinary errand on an ordinary night that turned into a tragedy the community would not forget. In the lead-up, investigators say the conflict was painfully mundane. Flanner later told officers she was angry because Mendoza had not returned a small household item, a marijuana grinder. There is no public record of a diagnosed mental illness or a long trail of documented threats, but the facts point to impulsive anger escalating into lethal violence. The absence of a deeper backstory does not diminish accountability. It underscores how quickly an argument can cross a fatal line. In early July of 2020, 2 surveillance cameras captured Flanner and Mendoza entering a convenience store together. Moments later, outside in the parking lot, Mendoza tried to get away before collapsing. Flanner fled. A witness attempted to help the wounded woman, and before losing consciousness, Mendoza identified Flanner as the shooter. The detail rings through the case file with stark clarity, a final identification from the victim herself, recorded and later repeated in court filings and official summaries. Tulsa police responded within minutes to reports of shots fired and quickly began piecing together what happened. Officers reviewed the security footage, traced the suspect's departure, and went to Flanner's residence where they located the vehicle seen leaving the scene. Inside, they found the firearm used in the offense. Because the crime occurred within the boundaries of tribal jurisdiction and involved a Native American defendant, federal authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, joined Tulsa police in the investigation. From the beginning, the case moved through federal court. A grand jury initially charged Flanner with serious offenses under Indian country jurisdiction. Court records show that the case later shifted toward a plea, and by the time of sentencing, prosecutors emphasized the security footage, the witness statement, and Flanner's own admission about the argument over the grinder. These evidentiary pillars removed any ambiguity about who fired the shot and why tempers mattered in those final moments. On Friday, January 24th of 2025, United States District Judge John F. Heil III sentenced Flanner for second-degree murder in Indian country and for discharging a firearm during a crime of violence. The sentence, 20 years in federal prison followed by 5 years of supervised release. The United States Attorney for the Northern District of Oklahoma announced the outcome, and the official release detailed the timeline, the evidence, and the collaboration between federal agents and Tulsa police. Public reaction was a mixture of heartbreak and disbelief, amplified by regional and national coverage that highlighted the trivial spark behind the violence. News reports echoed the government's account 2 relatives entered a store together. An argument spun out of control. A life ended in a parking lot, and a young woman now faces decades in federal custody. The ordinariness of the dispute became the most disturbing element, proof that everyday resentments can in an instant turn catastrophic. As for motive, the record points to anger and impulsivity rather than a complex scheme. There are no public psychological evaluations released that excuse or diminish responsibility. If anything, the facts suggest a combustible mix of personal grievance and immediate access to a firearm, an emotionally charged decision that cannot be undone and cannot be rationalized after the fact. Experts often caution that impulsive violence leaves behind the same devastation as calculated crime. This case is a stark illustration. This story ends with moral clarity. A family lost Estrella Mendoza, and no sentence can balance that loss. The court's judgment affirms accountability and sends a necessary message: no irritation, no argument, no slight, however personal, justifies taking a life. The impact radiates outward from a single parking lot to loved ones who will carry grief for years. Justice in this case is firm, and the lesson is unmistakable. When anger holds the match, society must insist on boundaries, on restraint, and on the value of every human life. 2. Christine Ann Roberts. Christine Ann Roberts appeared to neighbors as a familiar presence in East Nashville, a 73-year-old wife sharing a modest home with her husband Thomas Roberts, a well-known and well-respected lighting technician in the music industry. There is little public record of her professional life or social circle. Most details that emerged came only after tragedy. What the community knew for certain was the couple's public image a long marriage in a quiet neighborhood far from the spotlight Thomas often worked beneath on concert stages. That image shattered in the summer of 2023 when a deadly confrontation unfolded on their front porch. Prosecutors later described the immediate trigger as an argument between husband and wife. In the earliest hours of the investigation, Christine told officers she had shot Thomas because she believed he had been unfaithful. There is no publicly documented history of diagnosed mental illness in this case and no official record of prior threats presented at trial. Instead, the state's narrative emphasized anger and accusation inside a strained relationship, a combustible moment that moved rapidly from words to irreversible harm. The emotional volatility is unmistakable, even if deeper psychological explanations were never offered in open court. It happened in July of 2023 at the couple's East Nashville residence. Police reported that Thomas was struck by a single round on the porch where he collapsed as neighbors and first responders converged. Christine did not flee. When East Precinct officers arrived, she acknowledged firing the shot. A pistol was recovered at the scene. The stark geography of the crime, the threshold of a shared home, heightened the sense of rupture that rippled through friends in the music community that knew Thomas for his backstage artistry and reliability. Detectives charged Christine with criminal homicide the night of the shooting, and a judicial commissioner initially set bond while the case moved into the courts. Nearly 2 years later, a Davidson County jury heard the evidence during a 3-day trial. Jurors watched body-worn camera recordings and security video prepared as exhibits footage that captured parts of the incident's aftermath in the hours that followed. After deliberating for about 2 hours, the panel returned a verdict of first-degree premeditated murder. Under Tennessee law, and confirmed by prosecutors that conviction carries an automatic life sentence. Local coverage echoed the outcome, noting the speed of deliberations and the gravity of the punishment. The courtroom scene underscored the human cost. Family members traveled from out of state and even overseas to attend the proceedings, a testament to Thomas Roberts' reach beyond Nashville stages. When the verdict was announced, relatives expressed that justice had been served, even as they acknowledged the heartbreak that no sentence can undo. Their presence and their words reframed the case not as an abstract legal matter but as a family's loss carried across miles to a single room where accountability was finally declared. As for motive, the state did not present a complex scheme. The earliest statements pointed to jealousy and anger over alleged infidelity. The jury's finding of premeditation indicates they concluded Christine chose to end a life rather than walk away from a marital dispute. No psychological assessment was made public that would mitigate culpability, and none was cited to excuse the decision she made. In the measured language of the court, the evidence spoke for itself: a domestic argument, a firearm at hand, and an act that could not be taken back. This story demands a firm moral line. A husband died on the porch of his own home, and a community lost a professional whose work lit stages, but who now is remembered for the kindnesses he offered off them. The life sentence affirms society's refusal to accept domestic violence as a private matter or a momentary lapse. Anger, suspicion, and hurt never justify killing. Justice, in this case, means a clear denunciation of the act and solidarity with the people who will grieve Thomas Roberts for the rest of their lives. That clarity is the warning and the legacy. When tempers rise, there must be boundaries, and when those boundaries are crossed, accountability follows. 3. Christin Brianna Kelley. Christin Brianna Kelley, in her early 30s at the time of her federal indictment, and later 35 at sentencing, lived in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, away from headlines until a single morning changed everything. Public records do not paint a detailed picture of her work life or social presence. What the community learned about her came largely from federal filings and courtroom proceedings that followed a deadly encounter in nearby Sand Springs. In those documents, she is identified as a citizen of the Muskogee, also known as Creek Nation, a fact that would shape where and how the case was prosecuted. If there were simmering tensions or clear warning signs, they were not laid out in official statements. Prosecutors did not offer a complex backstory or diagnosed mental health condition to explain what happened. The absence of a publicly stated motive leaves only the stark reality of a fatal decision. In true crime, silence about motive is not uncommon, and it never lessens responsibility. It simply marks the line between confirmed evidence and speculation. The picture that remains is of a relationship, whatever its nature, that ended with irreversible harm, and a defendant whose actions would be measured in a federal courtroom rather than the court of rumor. Shortly after 4 in the morning on Tuesday, January 9th of 2024, Kelley and Isaac Smith sat inside a parked car in the lot of a gas station in Sand Springs. In those pre-dawn minutes, she fired a handgun and Smith collapsed in the vehicle. Kelley left the weapon nearby, discarding the loaded pistol in a trash can steps from the car, a decision that would later become a key piece of physical evidence. The setting, an ordinary parking lot under fluorescent lights, underscored how quickly an everyday place can become the center of a tragedy. Detectives from Sand Springs, joined by federal agents, traced the events with the help of witness accounts and the recovered firearm. Because the crime took place in Indian country, and the defendant is a Muskogee citizen, the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Oklahoma led the prosecution with assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The agency's coordinated work detailed in official releases framed a straightforward chain of proof, a timeline, a location, a victim identified by name, and a weapon found exactly where investigators were told to look. Kelley ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in Indian country. On Thursday, May 1st of 2025, a federal judge sentenced her to 240 months in prison, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. She will serve her term in federal custody and be transferred to the Bureau of Prisons. The case was cited as part of Project Safe Neighborhoods, the Department of Justice initiative that focuses on reducing violent crime by pairing federal resources with local partnerships. Regional outlets amplified the outcome, noting the collaboration between tribal, federal, and local authorities. What does the record say about motivation? Little beyond the unambiguous fact that Kelley pulled the trigger. No psychological report has been released publicly that would mitigate culpability, and none is needed to judge the act itself. Experts often distinguish between planned and impulsive violence, but both leave the same devastation. In this case, the court's acceptance of a second-degree murder plea captures that reality, a life taken without legal justification, and intent formed in the moment or in the hours before, and consequences that extend far beyond any single hearing. This case ends with moral clarity. Isaac Smith is gone, and no sentence will repair what his family lost. The guilty plea and lengthy federal term do not restore a life. They stand as a public declaration that an argument, a grievance, or a moment of anger can never justify killing. The message is simple and necessary. When tempers flare, the only safe path is away from violence. Communities depend on that restraint to protect ordinary places, parking lots, porches, and sidewalks from becoming scenes of grief. Justice here is firm, and it is right to say so. For LaFredia Todd. LaFredia Todd was a restaurant worker in North Myrtle Beach, better known to co-workers than to the wider community. In her mid-30s at the time of the crime and trial, she shared line shifts and closing duties with a tight kitchen crew at Nacho Hippo, a lively spot near the beach. Before the shooting, she had no public profile beyond the workplace, and what the community later learned about her came almost entirely from police records, court testimony, and the voices of co-workers who took the stand. The man she killed, Quentin Johnson, was himself a Nacho Hippo employee known to friends and family for his energy and plans beyond restaurant life. Their connection was professional first personal by proximity and fatally volatile by the night it mattered most. Prosecutors and defense lawyers described clashing narratives of what led up to the gunfire. Todd claimed a hostile work environment, telling jurors she felt cornered, harassed, and threatened over time. Some witnesses supported that account, testifying that they heard frightening statements directed at her. Others pushed back, including a manager who said he was never told of any threats and would have intervened if he had known. No mental health diagnosis was presented publicly to explain Todd's decision that night. Instead, the courtroom record tracks an escalating workplace conflict interpreted in opposite ways by people who worked shoulder to shoulder in a high-pressure kitchen. The shooting happened late on a summer night on Thursday, July 28th of 2022, inside the kitchen of the North Myrtle Beach restaurant. Surveillance video recovered by investigators captured crucial moments, and company records showed both employees had already clocked out when the violence erupted. Todd later called dispatch and directed officers to the firearm, which police recovered where she said it would be. Johnson was rushed to a hospital and died a few days later, turning a late-night emergency into a homicide case that would pull in investigators, grieving relatives, and eventually a jury. The ordinariness of the setting of prep-line stainless steel counters the last minutes of a shift, made the loss feel even more senseless to those who knew him. Before trial, Todd's attorneys sought immunity under South Carolina's Stand Your Ground law. After reviewing testimony and new video exhibits, a judge denied that request, finding the defense had not met the burden to show lawful self-defense. The case proceeded to trial in January of 2025. Over the span of about a week, jurors saw booking footage, heard co-workers, managers, and family members, and weighed Todd's own testimony that she felt she had no choice. After roughly 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts for murder and for possessing a weapon during a violent crime. The judge imposed a life-shaping term, 36 years for murder and 5 years on the weapons offense to run at the same time. By law, the murder sentence is not eligible for early release. Johnson's family, while wishing the punishment had been life, told reporters they believed justice at last had been served. What motivated Todd, in a deep psychological sense, remains unsettled beyond her courtroom statement of fear. Prosecutors framed the evidence as a decisive act, not a defensive one, pointing to the video timeline, the fact that both parties had clocked out, and the recovery of the gun where she said she placed it. The defense insisted the threats were real and that her fear was reasonable. Juries must choose between stories. This jury chose the state's. No expert assessment released publicly has softened her responsibility for what she did. An appeal has since been filed, a reminder that the legal process may continue even as the facts of the verdict stand. This case deserves an unblinking conclusion. A man's life ended in a workplace where people cook meals and share jokes after long shifts. A community lost a son, a partner, a father, and a colleague. The sentence does not restore him. It affirms that a gun is never a solution to anger, conflict, or fear on the job. Todd's claims of harassment and threats, contested as they were, cannot justify killing. The moral line is clear. When tensions rise, we step back, seek help, and protect life. Crossing that line destroys families, scars communities, and forfeits freedom. Accountability here is firm, and it is necessary. 5. Inoue. Inoue was 44 years old when the case that would define her name began in a quiet Tempe apartment. She was a mother of 2 young children, Mia and Kai, navigating the rough edges of an unraveling marriage and a looming move back to Japan that had become a point of argument with her estranged husband. To neighbors, she was largely private. To police and the courts, she would soon be a defendant whose actions tore through a community. In the hours before the killings, officers responded to a domestic dispute, spoke with the adults, and left after ensuring the children appeared safe. Nothing in those minutes foretold the devastation that would follow. The record of triggers is stark and incomplete. Prosecutors later framed the crime as the product of rage and control within a collapsing relationship, citing arguments over money and the impending move. Inoue herself told police she heard voices, a claim that surfaced again at sentencing when she denied that her children were dead. Those statements, however unsettling, never translated into a medical diagnosis in open court, and they do not soften responsibility. What remains clear is the pressure of divorce, financial strain, and emotional volatility converging in a home where 2 sleeping children should have been safe. In the early morning of mid-May 2021, while Mia and Kai slept, Inoue carried out a lethal attack using a kitchen cleaver. Prosecutors would later describe the violence as extreme. Afterward, she attempted to wipe away signs of what had happened and drove to a nearby police station. There, speaking through an interpreter, she told officers that she believed she had killed her children and referenced hearing voices. Investigators rushed to the apartment and found a scene that confirmed her words, setting in motion an arrest and a case that would span years and echo in headlines across the country. From the outset, the investigation drew on patrol reports, forensic work inside the apartment, and recorded interviews. The Arizona Department of Child Safety later released a brief summary confirming that Inoue was arrested the same day on suspicion of 2 counts of first-degree murder. In the courtroom, jurors saw a timeline that began with the domestic call, moved through the hours that followed, and ended with Inoue's own statements at the police station. In February of 2025, a Maricopa County jury convicted her of 2 counts of first-degree murder along with related counts of child abuse and disorderly conduct. On Friday, May 2nd of the same year, the judge imposed 2 consecutive natural life terms ensuring she will never be released, and added decades more for the additional crimes. As to motive, the state argued that Inoue acted to lash out at her estranged husband, turning private anger into unspeakable harm. The defense floated alternative explanations, including suggestions about physical capability, but the jury's verdict reflects a finding of deliberate, premeditated intent. At sentencing, the court noted the incomprehensible fear the children must have felt and rejected Inoue's denial that they were gone. Local and national coverage emphasized the earlier police visit and the chilling contrast between a home briefly checked and a crime carried out soon after, reinforcing the case's emotional gravity. This story must end with judgment, not ambiguity. 2 children lost their futures, and a community carries grief that no sentence can repair. The court's decision, natural life terms with no possibility of release, is a statement of society's refusal to excuse domestic horror regardless of stress, anger, or claimed voices. If warning signs were missed, they are lessons for all of us about vigilance and intervention. They are never a reason to blur accountability. Mia and Kai deserved ordinary mornings and long lives. The justice delivered in this case cannot bring them back, but it does draw a firm moral line. Children are not bargaining chips in adult conflict, and those who destroy them for any reason face the fullest measure of the law. 6. Suad Mohamed Ali. Suad Mohamed Ali was in her late 20s when a tragedy inside a Pelican Rapids home would redefine her name for the state of Minnesota and far beyond. A mother with few public details on employment or social life, she lived with the demands and stresses familiar to many young parents, but investigators later said the fault lines in that household ran far deeper. On a summer night in mid-July, the life of her 3-year-old daughter ended, and the picture of a family became the center of a criminal case that drew state and national attention. Prosecutors described a volatile mix of exhaustion, anger, and untreated mental illness. According to the record, Ali told authorities that her child's crying for food triggered her rage. Both the state and the defense would later acknowledge that she suffered from mental health issues, and earlier in the case a judge found her incompetent to proceed, pausing the prosecution until she could be evaluated and restored. None of those facts excused her actions, and none would ultimately alter the legal judgment that followed. They merely set the stage for how swiftly parental frustration spiraled into irreparable harm. It happened before dawn on Monday, the July 10th of 2023, inside the family's residence. First responders arrived to find the little girl unresponsive as efforts to revive her began. Reports note a disturbing detail. Ali was observed smiling as emergency crews worked. In subsequent interviews, she admitted that she had killed her daughter, saying she covered the child's face to stop the crying, and she also stated she had earlier attempted to stab the child but did not follow through. The method was blunt in its cruelty, without needing graphic description, and the emotional disconnect documented at the scene added a chilling dimension to the case. From there, the investigation moved quickly. Pelican Rapids police secured the home-gathered statements and relayed the case to county prosecutors. Medical staff at a nearby hospital later pronounced the child dead. Charging documents and subsequent court summaries laid out a direct chain of evidence built on Ali's own statements, witness accounts from the scene, and the absence of any plausible alternate explanation. The result was an arrest for second-degree murder and a case that would take nearly 2 years to resolve as competency concerns and plea negotiations unfolded. In late April of 2025, Ali pleaded guilty to second-degree murder without intent. At the sentencing hearing on Monday, June the 24th of the same year, the judge imposed a fixed prison term of 12.5 years. Under Minnesota's determinate sentencing system, most felony defendants must serve roughly 2/3 of their term in prison and the remaining 1/3 on supervised release, assuming no disciplinary violations. Based on time already served, records indicate Ali's anticipated release falls in the latter part of 2031. The courtroom's tone was somber. Officials noted her lack of remorse and the enduring pain felt by the child's family. What motivated her beyond the immediate claim of frustration and the broader context of mental illness remains partly opaque. There is no credible theory of revenge or financial gain. Instead, the narrative points to an overwhelmed parent whose response to a crying child crossed into criminal violence. Experts often warn that stress isolation and untreated psychiatric symptoms can magnify impulsive reactions. Still, those realities never reduce responsibility. In this case, the court's acceptance of the plea and the sentence imposed underscore that principal psychological factors help explain, but they do not absolve. This story must end with moral clarity. A child was denied the safety every home must provide. No exhaustion, no illness, and no moment of anger justifies taking a young life. The sentence does not restore the future that was stolen, but it affirms society's duty to protect the most vulnerable and to condemn those who harm them. Let this case be a warning and a call when caregiving feels overwhelming. Ask for help. When mental health falters, seek treatment. When you see danger, intervene. Accountability here is firm, and it is right. The memory that should endure is the child's and our resolve to keep other children safe. 7. Aurielle Montgomery. Aurielle Angelique Montgomery was in her early 20s when police and prosecutors say she became the sole adult responsible for a little girl who never reached her second birthday. Friends and neighbors did not know much about her work or social life. What emerged came later through charging papers and court hearings. Reporters would note a painful contradiction: a young mother, a toddler found unresponsive, and evidence pointing back to the only caregiver present. By the time of sentencing, she was 24 years old, no longer anonymous and forever linked to a case that shook families across Baltimore. What led to this, prosecutors did not claim a complex plot or a clear singular trigger. Instead, they described conduct showing reckless disregard for life, the kind of extreme indifference that Maryland law recognizes under the depraved heart form of second-degree murder. The record includes no public psychological diagnosis to excuse what happened, though the court did later require mental health screening and substance use treatment as part of the sentence, a sign that the system saw risk factors that needed evaluation without letting them weaken accountability. On a Sunday in October of 2020, 2 first responders were called to a Baltimore home for a report of an unresponsive 1-year-old. Charging documents later recounted unsettling details without resorting to gore. The child felt cold to the touch, and an adult at the scene described finding her in an odd position. An autopsy reported multiple signs of trauma and severe internal injuries the medical examiner said were severe enough to directly cause her death. Detectives determined that Montgomery was the child's sole guardian at the time. Those facts shaped the investigation from its first hours. Within months, the Capital Area Regional Fugitive Task Force arrested Montgomery in the Pikesville area, and Baltimore police announced the case publicly. She was charged and booked as the homicide investigation continued. Local outlets followed the developments, closely tracing a straight line from the scene to the courtroom. The response called the autopsy findings and the conclusion that this was not an accident. In early May of 2025, Montgomery pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for the death of her daughter, Inoue Gilliard. In mid-July of the same year, the judge imposed a sentence of 40 years, suspending all but 22 years, followed by 5 years of probation. The court also ordered mental health evaluations and substance abuse treatment. Newsrooms emphasized that the police spared her a possible life sentence while still reflecting the gravity of taking a child's life. Coverage also revisited the original reports the child found cold, the odd position, and the examiner's conclusion about the fatal injuries. What then explains the crime? The file offers no motive beyond a pattern of reckless harm toward an infant who depended entirely on her caregiver. This is not a story of financial gain or calculated revenge. It is a story of neglect turned violent, of responsibility abandoned, and of choices a jury never had to weigh because the defendant admitted guilt. Court-ordered treatment acknowledges that personal struggles may exist, but those struggles do not erase culpability. The legal label here matters second-degree murder rooted in utter disregard for human life. This case demands a clear moral verdict. A child died in the place where safety should have been guaranteed. No frustration, no stress, and no private hardship can justify that outcome. The sentence does not bring Inoue back, but it draws a necessary line. When a caregiver inflicts fatal harm, society responds with accountability and a promise to protect other children. Let the memory that endures be Inoue Gilliard's short life, and the community's resolve to notice danger sooner, to intervene faster, and to insist that every child's home be a refuge, not a risk. 8. Lashanda Wilder. Lashanda Wilder was in her early 30s, a mother in Columbus, when she stepped into the harshest possible spotlight for all the wrong reasons. She was known, if at all, only within her Milo Grogan neighborhood, raising children in a modest home. That privacy shattered when she told police her 8-year-old son Martonio had disappeared during the night. Officers canvassed streets and alleys. Neighbors joined the search, and for a few anxious hours the city clung to hope that a missing child would be found safe. The facts that emerged would end that hope and fix Wilder's name to a crime that stunned even veteran investigators. Prosecutors never presented a tidy motive. This was not a case of financial gain or a stranger's intrusion. It was a household crime concealed at first by a story that unraveled under scrutiny. In the record, what stands out is not an identifiable trigger but a pattern of deception, after the harm was done choices that revealed awareness and control. Detectives and later the court characterized Wilder's conduct as deliberate and profoundly indifferent to her son's life. The absence of a clear psychological explanation does not reduce responsibility. It simply marks the border between confirmed evidence and speculation. The turning point came on a summer afternoon in late June of 2024. After hours of searching, officers followed leads back to the Milo Grogan home. In the small attic, they discovered a trash bag, and inside it, the body of 8-year-old Martonio. Earlier, Wilder had told police she last saw him when she put him to bed around 9:30 at night, suggesting he might have run away. The discovery ended that narrative. An autopsy concluded the child died of asphyxia due to neck compression, a finding that transformed a missing child report into a homicide case. The setting, a family home that should have been safe, magnified the community's grief and anger. Investigators built the case with methodical care. They documented the timeline of Wilder's report, the neighborhood search, and the recovery in the attic. The medical examiner's conclusion about the cause of death became the anchor of the prosecution. In the days that followed, authorities also examined the roles of people close to Wilder. Her girlfriend Jonna Lowe faced separate charges connected to the child's death. She later pleaded guilty and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. That outcome further underscored that this was not a mystery without actors. There were choices, and the law responded to each of them. In mid-July of 2025, Wilder appeared in Franklin County Common Pleas Court and changed her plea to guilty. The legal consequences were immediate. A judge imposed a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years for murder. Wilder also admitted to gross abuse of a corpse and to theft related to the aftermath of the crime. The prosecutor's office stated plainly that the sentence matched the seriousness of taking a child's life, while local coverage emphasized the painful arc of the story, from a false alarm about a missing child to the confirmation of a homicide hidden in an attic. What does the record suggest about her mindset? There is no credible evidence of a delusion or a sudden break from reality that could excuse the act. The evidence points to a fatal assault followed by concealment and misdirection. If stress or personal hardship existed, they were not the cause in a legal or moral sense. Prosecutors framed Wilder's actions as a profound betrayal of duty, a mother who owed protection, and instead inflicted harm, then sought to hide it. The court's judgment affirms that view. This case must close on moral clarity. An 8-year-old boy lost his life, and a community was forced to confront the truth that a home can hold both love and danger. No frustration, no hardship, and no private struggle justifies ending a child's life or attempting to erase the evidence. The sentence does not heal the loss, but it draws a necessary line when caregivers become the source of harm. Justice must be swift and firm. Let the name that endures be Martonia Wilder's, and let it strengthen our resolve to notice warning signs to step in when a child is at risk and to insist that every home be a place of safety. 9. Michelle L. Basham. Michelle L. Basham lived most of her life in Tiptonville, a small community along the lake known to neighbors more as a familiar face than a public figure. In early 2021, she was 32 years old. Little is documented about her occupation or social life before the crime. What the public knows comes from investigative files and courtroom records. The victim, Birdie Mae Terry, was in her late 50s, a longtime resident who, on a winter weekend, stepped into her driveway before dawn and never returned home. The case would soon bear her name and galvanize a town that knew her as a kind presence on McBride Street. Prosecutors have never offered a single definitive motive. What emerged instead was a picture of a targeted attack carried out by people who knew the victim. Rumors of robbery or a personal grudge flickered in early conversations, but the official account focused on actions, not speculation, a plan, a gun, and a woman in her own driveway. The absence of a clear psychological explanation does not soften responsibility. If there were pressures or grievances in the background, they remained in the background. The foreground was a lethal choice made in the quiet hours before sunrise. It happened on Sunday, January 10th in the first hours of the morning. Investigators with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation later documented that Birdie Terry was shot while standing outside her home in the 800 block of McBride Street. She was rushed for treatment but died 3 days later from her injuries. The stark geography of the crime, a driveway in a neighborhood where people wave across porches, became part of the community's grief. The details were simple and devastating: a woman ambushed at home, an assailant or assailants who slipped back into the darkness, and a family left with questions that would take nearly 2 years to answer. From that morning forward, state agents took the lead. At the request of the district attorney, the Bureau opened a homicide investigation that grew slowly and methodically. Over the months that followed, they developed information that identified 2 suspects, Michelle Basham and Jared Scott. In mid-November of 2022, a Lake County grand jury returned indictments, and both were arrested. The agency's public summary, later echoed by local outlets, emphasized how careful work and community tips closed the distance between a darkened driveway and the names of the people believed to be responsible. The legal reckoning arrived in the summer of 2025. In Lake County Circuit Court, a jury heard the evidence and found Michelle Basham guilty of first-degree murder. Immediately after the verdict, the judge imposed a life sentence, as Tennessee law requires for that conviction. Her co-defendant, Jared Scott, received the same punishment. Reporters noted that the deliberations were brief, a sign of the case's clarity once the evidence was laid out. The district attorney's office issued a statement calling the killing another example of an innocent person taken from her family by senseless violence and pledging continued pursuit of violent offenders. The record offers only limited insight into Basham's inner world. There are no publicly reported evaluations that point to mental illness or delusion, and none were presented to mitigate culpability. What remains is a legal conclusion grounded in proof a planned act that ended a life. In the measured language of the court, guilt for first-degree murder means premeditation, and the sentence reflects society's highest condemnation within the bounds of the law. This story must close with moral clarity. A woman was attacked where she should have been safest, and a community carried the weight of that loss for years. No grievance, no rumor, and no private conflict justifies taking a life on a quiet street before sunrise. The convictions and life sentences cannot restore Birdie Mae Terry to the people who loved her, but they draw a firm line. Those who plan and carry out lethal violence will face the fullest measure of accountability. Let the memory that endures be hers, and let it sharpen our resolve to protect neighbors, insist on justice, and refuse to allow fear to rule a place that calls itself home. 10. Alexia Tells. Alexia Tells was 28 years old when a relationship argument in Oswego, Illinois, escalated into a fatal crime that would define her name in Chicago area headlines. Publicly little was known about her occupation or community life before the killing. What emerged afterward came through police affidavits, prosecutor statements, and a courtroom record that traced an ordinary evening turning irrevocably dark. The victim was her girlfriend, Anissa Ellen Williams, a young woman with plans of her own whose life ended after dispute inside a vehicle spilled into a cascade of desperate decisions. According to prosecutors, the trigger was not a long-plotted scheme, but a heated argument while the victim was driving. There is no public record of a diagnosed mental illness or sustained history of threats linked to Telly's. The state's narrative frames the violence as the product of anger inside an intimate relationship. What followed suggests calculation rather than confusion. Officials later said Telly's tried to pass off what happened as self-harm, a claim that investigators quickly challenged with evidence. That contrast from a moment of volatility to an attempted cover story shaped how the court and the public understood her actions. The crime unfolded in February of 2023. After the confrontation in the car, Anissa suffered a catastrophic head injury. Tells drove her to a residence and called for help, initially implying an accident or suicide. Despite rapid medical care, Anissa died from the injury. In the first hours, the scene might have looked ambiguous. But investigators would later say it was not. Their findings undermined the story Tells first told and pointed back to an act of intimate partner violence that ended one life and would soon put another behind bars. Detectives from Oswego Police, assisted by Illinois State Police and the county coroner, built the case piece by piece. Forensic testing, a digital trail, and Telly's own statements form the backbone of the evidence. Prosecutors said those facts showed Telly's intentionally killed her girlfriend and then tried to stage the death to look like suicide, a ruse that did not withstand scrutiny. In public statements, the Kendall County State's Attorney emphasized how difficult these prosecutions can be when only two people know the exact sequence of events and how careful investigative work can still deliver clarity. The legal resolution arrived in mid-July of 2025. Tells pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. A judge sentenced her to 30 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, to be followed by 3 years of mandatory supervised release. Under Illinois truth, in sentencing for first-degree murder, she must serve 100% of that prison term. Local and national coverage underscored prosecutors' view that the crime did not end at the moment of violence. It continued in the deliberate effort to mislead police and the public about how Anissa died. What can be said about motive? The record points to anger and control in a deteriorating relationship rather than a complex plan. There were no public psychological assessments offered to mitigate culpability. Advocacy groups and journalists used the case to highlight the reality of intimate partner violence in LGBTQ relationships, harm that can look like any other domestic homicide and deserves the same urgent attention from friends, neighbors, and authorities. The facts here speak in plain terms: a dispute in a confined space, a fatal injury, and a post-crime effort to erase responsibility. This story must end with moral clarity. A young woman lost her life, and no amount of regret or explanation can balance that loss. The sentence does not restore the future that was taken, but it affirms a principle that cannot bend love, is never a license for harm, and anger is never a defense for killing. When violence enters an intimate space, the only just response is accountability. Let the name we remember be Anissa Ellen Williams, and let her memory be a call to act sooner, to take threats seriously, to check on friends, and to insist that every relationship be measured by safety, dignity, and respect. 11. Brittany Nicole Holbrook. Brittany Nicole Holbrook shared a rented home on Big Coppitt Key with her longtime boyfriend Tyler Newlish and a roommate. She was in her mid-30s, known mostly within the Lower Keys community rather than to the wider public. Friends described the couple's life as ordinary island living, work, fishing photos, and late nights that sometimes ran long. That familiar picture shattered in the small hours of a June weekend in 2023 when a single gunshot inside the home ended Tyler's life and recast Holbrook from partner to defendant. Prosecutors later told the court that intoxication and anger ignited a deadly argument. Holbrook first claimed she could not remember what happened and later said she fired to protect herself, alleging that Tyler had strangled her. Investigators found no injuries consistent with strangulation and pointed to evidence that contradicted her account. From the state's perspective, this was not a split-second fight for survival, but an unjustified killing after a night of drinking. The theory of the case was stark: a domestic dispute, a weapon at hand, and a decision that crossed an irreversible line. What happened next was documented in the arrest records and replayed in local coverage. Startled awake by Holbrook's screams, the roommate rushed into the living room and found Tyler on the floor. As he tried to help, Tyler used his fading strength to identify who had shot him, using a profane phrase that left little doubt. Holbrook, according to deputies, showed no reaction to that accusation. Paramedics took Tyler to a nearby hospital, but he did not survive. Those early minutes, one voice naming the shooter, another claiming confusion, became the emotional core of the case that jurors would later hear. Detectives with the Monroe County Sheriff's Office built a methodical timeline. Scene work recovered a handgun and spent casing. Forensic findings established that Tyler had been shot from behind, a detail that undercut any self-defense narrative. Digital evidence and statements rounded out a picture that prosecutors said was clear and consistent. With those pieces in place, the case moved to trial on a second-degree murder charge. In late February of the following year, after a week of testimony, a jury needed less than an hour to convict Holbrook of second-degree murder. In mid-April, the judge imposed a 40-year state prison sentence. Because a firearm was used during the killing, Florida's 1020 life statute required that the first 25 years be served day for day without gain time credits. The state attorney called the punishment a measure of accountability and pointed to the dying declaration as the moment that cut through shifting explanations. For Tyler's family, the verdict brought relief, tempered by grief that no sentence could erase. Holbrook offered no psychological evaluation in open court that might explain her choices, and none was presented to mitigate responsibility. The most grounded reading of the record points to alcohol volatility and an effort to reshape the narrative after the fact. Advocates who track intimate partner violence stressed that these homicides do not always fit a neat pattern. They can unfold in ordinary homes between people who once posted smiling photos, and in moments when pride, fear, or fury make terrible decisions seem momentarily plausible. The law, however, does not weigh those impulses as a justification. This story must close with moral clarity. A man lost his life on a quiet island because someone he loved chose violence and then tried to bend the truth. No argument, no intoxication, and no after-the-fact story can excuse shooting an unarmed partner in the back. The sentence does not return Tyler Newlish to the people who loved him, but it draws a necessary line for every community. When tempers rise, the obligation is to walk away, not to reach for a weapon. When a life is taken, accountability must follow. That is justice's promise, and in this case it was kept.